Welcome everybody to this seminar, this research seminar at the Institute for Future Studies. We were happy to have Katya Rhodes here. Today you won't hear so much from me because the seminar is going to be run by Malcolm Fairbrother, Professor of Sociology at the Institute and IMU. So without further ado, I give the word to Malcolm. Malcolm, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Gustav. So it's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker. And welcome all of you. So Katya is an assistant professor in the School of Public Administration at the University of Victoria. Now, UVic, as it is more informally known, is not only her employing institution, it's also where I got my undergraduate degree. And so, so we just asked Katya where she's originally from. She's not actually she's originally from Russia, but not actually so close to here. But in a certain sense, Katya and I have moved in completely opposite directions in our careers, because she went from sort of this general part of the world to Britain, and then from there to Canada, and specifically Western Canada. I was born and grew up in Western Canada, moved to Britain, and then landed here. But we have very fortunately got to know each other a little bit, and we are now going to be research collaborators on a 5-year VR-funded project on decoupling. And so I'm very pleased to introduce her to the Institute, because I think there's a extremely high probability that she will be making an in-person visit at some point, and hopefully in the not-too-distant future, so people will get to know her that way as well. I just serendipitously noticed a little while ago today that one of these, fancy millennial sort of influencer types who's very prolific in social media and writing commentaries and so on, this guy Noah Smith, has written a sort of blog post called "Why Has Climate Economics Failed Us?" And it's a sort of informed diatribe, because he's a former professor of finance, but has now moved into media, criticizing climate economics. And I think it's quite interesting to hear the debate in environmental and climate economics and where that sort of stands. But the reason I'm very excited to work with Katya is that she is an excellent example of a climate economist who has definitely not failed us. And so not only is she an interesting researcher with a lot of current projects, which I believe she's going to talk about today, but she has also formerly worked in government in the Western Canadian province of British Columbia. And I think had quite an impact on the events there that she is also going to talk about sort of from a policy point of view. So that, I think, is a good introduction to where she's coming from, that she is going to, I think, bridge a little bit the academic and the applied, personal experience from working in government, but also discussing that from a sort of more objective kind of academic point of view. And without further ado, I will hand over to Katya, who's going to speak for something like 40 to 45 minutes in the usual way. If anybody has a point of clarification during the presentation, feel free to note that in the chat, and I believe Joe will then help me in keeping track of that, and we will try to get your questions of clarification answered if there are any. Otherwise, hold your questions for discussion or to ask Katya to elaborate on anything till the end. We'll have lots of time for Q&A. I should also note this is being recorded, and the first part of the Q&A will also be recorded and is going to be made available on the Future Studies website. So if you don't want to have anything recorded, leave your questions and comments till the latter part of the Q&A, which will not be on the website. Gustav, is there anything else I need to say at this point?
No, that was brilliant. Everything okay. I think.
So, Katya, so pleased to have you and looking forward to your presentation.
All right. Thank you, Malcolm. Thank you, Gustav, for having me. I'm very pleased to be here, and I wish I was there in person. And Malcolm and I were supposed to meet in May of 2020, but obviously kept delaying and nothing is happening. And things are actually getting worse here in British Columbia, Canada, in terms of COVID. But as you can see, the title of my presentation today is framed in a positive way, designing policies for climate success, because I think we can use these dark times to make a positive change, to transition to a zero-emission economy, to recover our economies in a positive way. So this is an outline of my talk. I will talk a little bit more about what I do in my work. Then I'll explain why I'm focusing on British Columbia. And I will do a quick overview of empirical evidence of why deep decarbonization is still very difficult at the global level. And I will review the key strategies for a simple path to climate success, drawing from lessons in British Columbia, in Canada at the federal level, as well as California. And then I want to discuss my current and future projects so that we have a discussion afterwards about potential collaborations. So, as Malcolm noted, I am a researcher. I work at the University of Victoria, and in my research, I focus on the design of effective and politically acceptable climate policies. I like studying consumer motivations for adopting low-carbon technologies, and I like studying public and stakeholder support for different types of climate policy. And for that, I use survey methods and energy economy models that incorporate human behavior in order to realistically project impact of different policies on emissions and economic outcomes. At the university, I teach and supervise students on the various related topics. Some of my most interesting courses include sustainability transitions, where we focus on interdisciplinary aspects of climate change mitigation, as well as ecological economics and the associated quantitative methods. In the past, I worked in the BC government. Here's a picture of the legislature here, where I helped design the current Clean BC climate plan. And I'll talk more about the plan and its contents in my presentation. Before that, excuse me, I worked at the Pembina Institute, the non-for-profit think tank that influences policy decisions here in British Columbia and also in other regions of Canada. I worked on a study comparing public perceptions of the BC carbon tax at the time of its implementation. And my very, very first job in Canada was in the Vancouver Economic Commission when I came to Canada back in 2009. And I studied green jobs. I developed, with a few other colleagues, the first green jobs methodology, at least that I know of, in North America. And of course, with my academic position, there are lots of engagement opportunities. I'm currently president of a Canadian Association for Ecological Economics. It's a chapter of the International Association that publishes ecological economics. And it's funny that I'm running that organization of ecological economists, but I'm an interesting ecological economist, not a very pure one. And so, the first picture I was supposed to explain, this is where I am. This is a snapshot of the University of Victoria that's located here, and you can see that we have very beautiful landscapes. So I will draw on all of these experiences as a researcher and as a previous climate policy maker to discuss the key lessons from British Columbia. So now, why British Columbia? You can see this map, the map of Canada, and you can see British Columbia here. It's a large province. It's actually the third largest Canadian province and the fourth largest provincial economy. We have about 4.7 million people living here. BC is Canada's most western province. It's located between the Pacific Ocean here and Rocky Mountains. Half of British Columbians live in the Metro Vancouver area. It's right here on the border with the United States. It's right across the ocean from Victoria. And the other most populated area is located in the southern tip of Vancouver Island. So you see Victoria, this is where I'm located. So most of the population lives here. British Columbia is similar in many ways to Sweden. That's why I think this presentation is interesting to Swedish people. Most of our electricity is generated from hydro and other renewables, similar to Sweden. 60% of our land base is productive forest, and BC is one of the world's largest exporters of wood products. We have a history of being a resource-dominated economy, centered mostly on forestry industry and some mining. However, employment in this resource sector has been declining steadily, and now new jobs are appearing, and most of the jobs are now in construction and retail and service sectors. So our economy is becoming more diverse, however, still a big dependence on the forestry sector. Similar to Sweden, we have two major political parties. So similar to Sweden's left-center Social Democrats Party, we have a new Democratic Party that is currently in charge of the province. And similar to Sweden's center-right Moderates Party, we have the BC Liberals Party. However, our electoral system is different from Sweden. In BC and in Canada in general, we don't have proportional representation. So we have the first past the post electoral system. Although 2 years ago, we had the referendum here in British Columbia trying to change that, trying to move to the proportional representation system. But that didn't happen. And I think part of that was, as I say on this slide, low trust in government, but also very poor communication on the government part about what that system would look like. They made it sound very complicated. And finally, British Columbia is similar to Sweden because we are climate policy leaders, at least in Canada, and we used to be climate policy leaders on the carbon tax in North America. Back in 2008, we implemented the first serious carbon tax in North America, as well as several flexible climate regulations. And I'll talk about those later in my presentation. So we have a clean electricity standard that is similar to a renewable portfolio standard, but it requires generation of electricity from clean sources, including compared to the renewable portfolio standard, the clean electricity standard allows generation from fossil fuels with carbon capture and storage. But for the most part, we comply with just hydroelectricity. We have a zero emission vehicle mandate. We have a low carbon fuel standard. We have a new requirement for renewable natural gas for buildings and methane regulations. And all of that is in this Clean BC climate plan that I'll talk about later. And BC's leadership has been on climate, has been a product of a lot of factors, including, of course, the fact that our leaders, our politicians are concerned with climate change mitigation, but also BC has experienced some pretty unique impacts from climate change, including massive pine beetle outbreaks in the last 2 decades that resulted in the loss of 1 million of hectares of our pine forest, as indicated by this red area on the map of BC. You can see that compared to the size of British Columbia, the outbreaks are quite large. And this is what our dying pine forest looks like. In addition to that, we seem to consistently experience wildfire seasons now in August and September, basically the best months of the year in British Columbia. We experience a lot of smoke, and if wildfires are not happening right here in BC, we have them happening in our neighboring jurisdictions, the state of Washington and California, and air quality is affected negatively anyway. So we're all experiencing these impacts, and British Columbia understands we need to act on climate change. Sweden understands that. But why is the world not transition? Why is deep decarbonization still so difficult, globally speaking, and also at national levels in other places? And you've all seen this quote many times, but of course, the answer has to do with self-interest. There is a myth that fossil fuels are scarce and expensive, that one day we'll run out of them, and therefore they will be very expensive. So what's the point of being concerned with climate change? Well, the fact is that fossil fuels are plentiful, high quality, and low cost, and we know that their price falls with ongoing innovation and declining demand. Especially now when we're dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic and the demand is not as high as it could be. And we know that fossil fuels offer the cheapest developmental path, as shown on this graph, for many countries, and especially China in the time period between 1990 and 2015. Sorry. All right. And so because fossil fuels are so cheap and high quality, renewables are not winning on their own without any climate policy in place. This graph here shows global energy use in terms of annual increases of fossil fuels and renewables and nuclear in green, fossil fuels in black. And as you can see over time, there is no clear pattern in annual increases of either types of energy. And that's because there is no pattern. We sometimes have situations, coincidental situations, when at the time of the Paris Agreement, we had a similar increase in, or even higher increase in the use of renewables than fossil fuels, but then the trend changed, and that had to do with the development, innovation in shale gas in the United States. And so whenever a new innovation happens in fossil fuels, then the annual increases are much higher for fossil fuels than renewables. And because fossil fuels are cheaper, renewables will not be winning without stringent climate policy. And as you know, fossil fuel emissions are still growing rapidly. Maybe in our countries like Canada and Sweden, they're stabilizing or decreasing. In the most of the developing countries, the trend is projected to be very different, and emissions are increasing over time. The second main challenge and the reason behind of failing to act on climate change is this myth of a voluntary global agreement. We all know that climate change mitigation requires a collective global effort because we are just a fraction of a problem, and therefore we are a fraction of solution. However, our governance institutions globally are quite weak and diplomacy is ineffective. And for the last 25 years, we've been trying to negotiate this voluntary binding agreement that would make everyone act in the world. But because of the voluntary nature, we are not all acting on climate change. And obviously, there are many other reasons associated with this global effort, including the debate between rich and poor countries about the fair sharing of the cost of action. And will that kind of binding voluntary agreement happen? Probably not on time to address the climate change issue as shown in this cartoon. The third challenge is a myth of a rational domestic policy process, and I'm sure you understand what I mean. But here in Canada and elsewhere in the world, in most countries in the world, it is very difficult to reduce climate change, even for the most climate concerned and climate sincere politicians. And that's because fossil fuels are part of our life. So there is lots of self-interest that's happening on part of corporations and individuals who continue to use fossil fuels and enjoy their benefits. Here again, in Canada and in many countries in the world, there are so many climate insincere politicians, those who introduce targets far into the future, but then delay implemented policies that would achieve them. And these politicians also like to make up their own stories about economic harms from the most effective and economically efficient policies, such as the carbon tax, as it was the case in Ontario with the Scrap the Carbon Tax campaign, and as it was the case in France. And this domestic policy process is complicated by a bunch of delusions and biases found in social psychology, political science. I just list them here as a quick review of the key biases. So there are deliberate delusions. Obviously, there are people who say climate science is uncertain, that we need to wait for research and development. That there is no point in acting until everyone acts in the world. There are also perfectionism views. There are people like you and me who strongly believe that, who completely agree with climate science and strongly believe in climate action. But we keep arguing between each other about the best way to achieve decarbonization, be it either with nuclear power or hydro or biofuels, carbon capture and storage. We argue about the best type of policy to reduce climate change, such as carbon taxes versus regulations. The key is not to let perfection be the enemy of the good. There are also many wishful thinking biases associated with the lack of understanding of scientific evidence regarding best ways to decarbonize our economies. There is this belief that energy efficiency is cheap and easy, it's always profitable. Well, we know it's not exactly true when we account for behavioral preferences and large investment costs in the beginning. There is also here, especially in North America, there is this, not myth, but there is the statement that many politicians use when they run their campaigns. They say the key issue in climate change mitigation is the fact that we have fossil fuel subsidies and they have the biggest effect. So people try to focus on removing those subsidies. But the reality is that even when they are removed, we still need to have a supportive climate policy to transition from fossil fuels. And if we have stringent climate policy, fossil fuel subsidies don't play any role because fossil fuel industry is regulated under alternative climate policy. And there are many agenda hitching biases, including biases that ecological economists have about stopping capitalism, economic growth, population growth, and this is something that Malcolm and I are going to investigate in our collaborative grant. The key point here is that the fossil fuel industry loves this kind of views, biases, delusions, and deliberately uses this to stall action in all jurisdictions in the world. And so now there is a new challenge. There is this myth that COVID-19 pandemic has permanently changed our lifestyles and reduced our energy consumption. And I've seen a lot of social media articles on this topic, especially in the beginning of the pandemic when panic was quite high. But we all know that the pandemic is a temporary event, or at least we hope. And we also know from the past, financial crisis events, that during such events, fossil fuels become cheaper and decarbonization becomes more difficult. So right now it's more expensive, more difficult for an electric vehicle to compete with a gasoline vehicle. And this is just a graph of oil prices. And you can see that here in 2020, we experienced quite a significant decline. But I argue that this is also our opportunity to act. This is a policy window when people don't pay that much attention to environmental issues and to stringent climate policy. And this is an opportunity to recover economies in a low carbon way. So this is an opportunity to implement climate policy when climate isn't the most immediate threat. Health and economy are the most immediate concerns for most people in the world. And in fact, many countries are using this policy window right now. Half of recovery money in G20 countries is currently spent on clean energy policy, as shown on this graph. And you can obtain the most interesting, updated information about clean spending on the Energy Policy Tracker website. I'm currently working with a few researchers in the University of Victoria to unpack this data and to make sure that these green investments are in fact green, trying to understand the impact on greenhouse gas emissions in the G20 countries. So we know the challenges now, we know why we are lagging on climate actions. Is the path to climate success simple or complicated? And I have this quote that I took out of internet by a climate reporter, but I'm sure you can find many other similar quotes. The main idea behind the quote is that in order to decarbonize our societies, we need to absolutely change everything in the way we, how we live, how we get around, how we make our money, which makes it sound very difficult in terms of the path to climate success. But I argue that for the most part, the path is simple. And it includes three main aspects. So the first aspect or strategy is to focus on key actions in key sectors, using the most up-to-date model information, scientific information, economic information. So the key actions, as we know, include rapidly phasing out burning of coal and oil for the most part, and then most of the uses of natural gas. And these actions must happen in key sectors, in key emitting sectors, and those are electricity and transportation first, because we have technologies in these sectors and costs of these technologies are quite modest. We can also act in these sectors on our own, in our own jurisdictions, without waiting for others to act in these sectors, unlike trade-exposed industrial sectors that have that exposure to competitive disadvantage when there are no carbon tariffs in place. And also, electricity and transportation are responsible for over 50% of future greenhouse gas emissions, especially in developing countries. As shown on this slide, you can see that developed countries in 2050, under the business as usual scenario, are expected to have most of their emissions from electricity and transport, and non-OECD countries, so developing countries, also have slightly more than 50% of the emissions from these sectors. The second strategy, and I know it applies to most countries, and I would like to learn more about Sweden and about how you achieve decarbonization actions, because I know that Swedish people have a much higher trust in government, so maybe they don't require compulsory climate policy. But for the most part, the rest of the world requires compulsory climate policy to have those decarbonization actions in terms of phasing out coal and oil and most uses of natural gas happening. And in my world of climate energy policy, we classify policies in terms of compulsory ones and non-compulsory ones. So these non-compulsory climate policies have been implemented in most jurisdictions in the last 3 decades, and they typically include non-compulsory policies, those that don't require any action. They give an option of doing something on climate, but they don't have any penalties or fines associated with the policies. This include information campaigns, marketing campaigns, labels, subsidies, and some government procurement to government actions. And on the other hand, we have here compulsory policies that can be divided broadly into regulations and carbon pricing. On the carbon pricing side, we have carbon taxation and we have cap and trade. And on the regulatory side, we can have very prescriptive command and control like regulations that require achieving a particular greenhouse gas emission level or require adopting a very specific technology with non-compliance leading to penalties and fines. And we can have more flexible market-based regulations that are performance-based. They're also compulsory, but they allow for a technology choice, and they have some market-based mechanisms that allow for compliance through other ways, such as credit trade, and I will talk about this in a second. So the compulsory policy basics, as I just said, imply that we need to have either carbon pricing or regulations or both of these types of policies. Carbon pricing is, of course, always preferred because it's the cheapest way to reduce our emissions. It costs much lower than the cost of regulation. So most economists prefer carbon pricing, but the evidence shows that carbon pricing is very difficult in the world, except for countries like Sweden. Can I ask
a question of clarification? So,
yeah.
Subsidies are counted as not compulsory, but taxes are counted as compulsory in your way of dividing things up.
Yeah. So, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. That's not clear to me why you do that, but maybe you can explain that later.
Yeah, because carbon pricing provides an explicit price on emissions that individuals or agents in industry they have to face, and if they don't want to adopt a new technology, they have to pay the carbon price. So there is a consequence associated with this policy.
But from an economic perspective, if you instead decide to subsidize all green energy but not non-green energy, what's the difference? That means that you have to pay more if you use, non-green fuels.
What do you mean by subsidize?
Well, you could lower the price by having a subsidy from the state.
Okay, so when I talk about carbon pricing, I talk about it in isolation from any other supportive policies. So yes, you can design the policy to have a lot of compliance options, and you can design it so that the revenue is used for this kind of subsidies you're talking about from the state. When I'm talking about carbon pricing, I talk about an explicit price signal that's being put on emissions, and then individuals and businesses have to pay the price signal and decide what they want to do, pay the tax or implement a low carbon technology depending on what's cheaper to them. The main difference between this policy and that in the non-compulsory policy category is that non-compulsory policies, they include a lot of free riders. They include a lot of people who would have done these actions, low carbon actions anyway, but they would seek a subsidy because they're eligible. So it's an issue with our, for example, electric vehicle subsidies. Most electric vehicle owners would have bought that vehicle anyway because those vehicles are quite expensive. So if you buy a Tesla here in British Columbia, you still get a subsidy. But for the most part, you don't need it. And all the studies shows that vehicles like Teslas, free ridership is 95%. So this is something that carbon pricing doesn't offer. Carbon pricing, if designed at a stringent enough level and increasing over time, sends a pretty clear price signal to all agents in the economy, especially if it covers all agents in the economy, that they need to decide how to decarbonize their activities or pay the price.
Thanks.
But from an economic perspective, yeah, you can categorize things very differently. This is how I look at policies in my world, just to come up with strategies for effective decarbonization, trying to make sure people understand that this type of policies, they don't work, especially in countries like Canada and the United States. People need to be facing a compulsory policy with some consequences in order to reduce emissions. So carbon pricing or regulations are important policies to have, but carbon pricing is not essential, especially in places where it is very difficult. And it can be completely replaced with regulations. And as I said, flexible regulations can be designed to mimic some of the carbon pricing cost savings mechanisms, because they don't pick technology winners, so they let the market decide how to comply with them. So people can choose the technology they prefer, the technology that's cheaper to them. And they allow for credit trading between sellers to lower the compliance cost. But at the same time, they are mandatory. So they require action. They require compliance with a specific target. So what are the examples of flexible regulations? As I mentioned earlier in the talk, in BC, we have a clean electricity standard, but most US states and many other countries in the world have renewable portfolio standards in electricity. It's a policy, it's a flexible regulation that requires that all the electricity sellers achieve a minimum percentage of electricity generated from renewables. And if they can't do that, they can buy credits from firms who surpass this minimum percentage requirement, such as a wind farm, because a wind farm doesn't have any emissions. Another example is a zero-emission vehicle mandate, something that we have here in British Columbia. It's a requirement for all vehicle sellers to achieve a minimum percentage of zero-emission vehicle sales. And if they can't do it, they can again buy credits from firms who surpass this minimum percentage requirement, such as Tesla, because Tesla doesn't produce any gasoline vehicles. And there are many other types of flexible regulations, such as the low carbon fuel standard that we have here in British Columbia that requires reducing average carbon intensity in transportation fuels over time. So we have more and more of biofuels, especially ethanol, added to a fuel mix. There are vehicle emission standards that have been in place for many decades in many countries, fuel emission intensity standards, and energy efficiency obligations. And in fact, leading North American jurisdictions rely on flexible regulations. This is a chart of California's greenhouse gas emission reductions by 2025. And as you can see from this chart, carbon pricing in the form of cap and trade accounts only for 16% of emission reductions. And the rest of the reductions come from prescriptive and flexible climate regulations. And I will talk a little bit more about California before I go deeper into British Columbia, because for the most part, British Columbia copied California. So who is Arnold Schwarzenegger? I'm sure you know, an actor, but who was also governor, and he is behind all the most amazing changes in the climate world in California that were then replicated by British Columbia, and now being replicated by Canada at the federal level. So Arnold created this agency, the California Air Resources Board, that is a quasi-judicial environmental regulator. It receives mandate from state legislature and governor, and it has very strong powers to regulate, but not to tax. And since the implementation of the California Air Resources Board, California implemented a lot of flexible and prescriptive regulations, including vehicle emission standards, so low emission vehicle standard, ultra low emission vehicle standard, and then later a zero emission vehicle standard, a renewable portfolio standard in electricity, a low carbon fuel standard in transportation, and many efficiency regulations, and also in the industry cap and trade system. In BC, as I said, we kind of copied what the state of California did. Politicians were all trying to act on climate change back in 2007, 2009. That had to do with multiple factors, including the fact that the climate concern was rising. We had a bunch of events happening back then, such as Hurricane Katrina. The Inconvenient Truth movie came out. The Stern report on economics of climate change came out. So politicians of all stripes were keen to act, including Arnold and including our own premier here back then in British Columbia, Gordon Campbell. He was a popular right-of-center policy wonk and risk taker, so he was from our center-right party, not center-left. He was very interested on acting on climate change, and he realized that the financial crisis was a perfect opportunity to implement some stringent climate policy similar to the COVID-19 crisis. That's why I say I hope that this is a policy window for the rest of the world to act on. BC implemented its first emission targets back then, legislated them, and we joined California's Western Climate Initiative. We implemented, like I said earlier, the first serious carbon tax in BC, in North America. That carbon tax was designed to be revenue neutral. And so what that means is that all the revenue from the carbon tax was going towards income tax cuts for individuals and for corporations. And some revenue was going back to low-income households in lump sum checks. And that design was interesting, but as I will say later, or I can say now, it didn't really last. 80% of supporters of the carbon tax did not believe in the revenue neutrality of the policy, because it's hard for people to see that reduction in the income taxes that happens when they file their taxes, and there are a bunch of numbers, and people don't really see any benefits to themselves. And also potentially this has to do with the idea of how people value losses much higher than otherwise equivalent gains. It's really hard for people to see what will happen as a benefit of the carbon tax in the future. They see right away that they pay in the carbon tax when they buy gasoline at the fuel pump. So the revenue neutrality piece didn't last the whole time, so it was changed later to a different mechanism where a lot of money now goes back to, so all the money that the industry pays goes back to industry. Some money goes to the general revenue in government, and the rest goes in lump sums to low-income households and various stakeholders who are affected. And also some money goes to environmental projects, which from the economics perspective is not the most efficient use of carbon tax revenue. The most efficient use of any tax revenue is to reduce income tax cuts, because those are growth hindering taxes. And when you do that, there is this double dividend idea that lower income taxes allow for a new industry, for new sectors to appear, and economic growth continues. But people didn't like it, and people don't really link economic growth with the design of the carbon tax. And so in addition to the carbon tax, BC implemented several flexible regulations, low carbon fuel standard, clean electricity standard, vehicle emission standard. So we took this basically shotgun approach and implemented everything possible at once. So how did it work for British Columbia? Well, at the time, the party that implemented the carbon tax, as I said, was a center-right party, the BC Liberals. They were quite popular compared to the main opposition parties, the center-left party, NDP, New Democratic Party. And when the tax was implemented shortly before the economic crisis, the NDP party decided to use this as an opportunity to attack the BC Liberals to gain their own popularity. So they launched an Axe the Tax campaign. And the media was just full of negative comments about how the tax hurts everyone. And because of that, NDP gained some popularity, and the Liberals lost their popularity. But then the global economic crisis saved the day, because the Liberals were known for their strong fiscal policy, and because people trusted the Liberals for such financial crisis events. All the attention switched from the environment, from climate, to the economy and economic recovery. And basically, the carbon tax survived, but it survived barely. In the election a couple of months later, the BC Liberals were re-elected. So when they were re-elected, that was great. The carbon tax survived, but it was very difficult to defend the carbon tax in British Columbia. There was no space for facts or rational debates. That campaign of Axe the Tax was framed the carbon tax as a gasoline tax. Media just focused on negative framing from a variety of groups, including rural and suburban residents, northern residents, truck drivers, greenhouses, cement industry, even low-income advocates who the carbon tax was providing lots of checks for. They were not happy. And as I said earlier, even the carbon tax supporters did not equate income tax gains with compensating gas tax costs. So they didn't believe in revenue neutrality of the tax. And basically, that means that the carbon tax actually survived by luck. The next government couldn't cut it, so they froze it for a while, and the tax wasn't rising. So at the time, I've seen all these negative frames in the media, and I was very interested to understand what actually how the carbon tax compares to other types of policies, especially compulsory policies that I presented in my previous slides, such as the clean electricity standard that we have in British Columbia and the low carbon fuel standard. Why the media focuses only on the carbon tax, and what do people think about regulations in British Columbia? So I looked into, and I did some analysis, modeling and other analysis to identify emission reductions potentials from all the policies that we had in BC, like regulatory and carbon pricing. And the picture looks like this. So back then, by 2020, I assessed that the carbon tax was going to reduce 4 megatons of emissions. The clean electricity standard was going to reduce 15 megatons of emissions, much more than the carbon tax. And that's because when it was introduced, our authority, BC Hydro, that contracts out for electricity generation, basically canceled its plans to build 2 natural gas plants and 1 coal plant, avoiding these many emissions annually right away. And the low carbon fuel standard in its past design was going to reduce 4 megatons of emissions in transportation, very similar to the carbon tax. So I was trying to understand, like, what do people know about these policies? Do they support them? What happens when you give them the information about emission reductions from these policies? And does awareness about policy existence and knowledge about policy effectiveness in reducing emissions actually translate into higher support? So I published this paper that's called Does Effective Climate Policy Require Well-Informed Citizen Support? And I found that there was very little awareness of climate policy in general, except for the carbon tax. When I asked survey respondents to indicate in an open-ended question any climate policy that they thought was implemented in British Columbia, and that's like 5-7 years later after policies were implemented back in 2008, I found that most respondents, 73% of British Columbians, didn't even know one policy that had to deal with climate. And 25% indicated one policy, and the rest of the population indicated 2 policies that existed in British Columbia correctly. And so as part of this, part of the correct policy response, carbon tax was the main policy that people could identify. Almost no one could identify the clean electricity standard and the low carbon fuel standard as existing policies yet. As I showed to you in the previous slide, the emission reductions are much higher or the same as from the carbon tax. And then I asked people about their support for these policies, and I found that carbon tax has 7 to 10 times more strong opposition than the 2 key flexible regulation policies, the low carbon fuel standard and the clean electricity standard, as shown on this slide. And then I decided to compare the economic efficiency of these policies, so marginal abatement cost from these policies, with the political acceptability. So I created this crude measure of political difficulty, known as the relative, called as a relative political cost per ton. So basically took the information from the survey on the strong opposition to these policies and compared them among each other, and divided by the emission reduction potential for this policy. For these policies. So what I found is that the carbon tax was almost 11 times more politically costly to implement per ton of emissions reduced than the low carbon fuel standard, and was 28 times more politically costly to implement per ton than the clean electricity standard. So this is a very simple analysis. This is nothing that's complicated, and it's not a proven concept, but it was just interesting to compare the levels of strong opposition to emission reductions from these policies. And when you compare these numbers to actual marginal abatement costs in dollars per ton of CO2 reduced, of course, you find that the carbon tax is the cheapest possible policy. The clean electricity standard was very expensive because it resulted in the shutdown of natural gas and coal generation plants, and low carbon fuel standard was slightly less expensive, but still more expensive than the carbon tax. And that's compared to these numbers that suggest that the carbon tax is many times more politically difficult than these policies that have a much higher economic cost. So with this information, policymakers can decide whether they want to focus on economic efficiency benefits of the carbon tax, or maybe not, because the political costs are quite high. So maybe it's okay to implement policies that are economically inefficient but effective at reducing emissions and have much lower political costs. This is especially true in jurisdictions that try to implement carbon pricing, but it's very difficult. So in those places where it is difficult, it probably makes sense to focus on regulations. And then I did a simple regression analysis to understand whether that awareness and the open-ended question also had a different closed-end question about the knowledge about effectiveness of policies at reducing emissions, whether those things actually matter for public support for policy, for climate policy, for all types of climate policies. And I found that for all the policies that were tested in the study, neither awareness nor knowledge of climate policies played any role in predicting or explaining public support. But in terms of significant variables, I found that what people believe about policy effectiveness, their own perceptions of the policy, the altruistic values and trust in the renewable industry, as well as being a female, were the most significant predictors for all policies. And then I did a quasi-experiment in that same study. I measured people's support for those 5 key policies in BC. Then I give them information about the effectiveness of those policies in reducing emissions, and I tested their support for policies once again. And what I found is that information had no statistically significant effect on support for most policies, and even reduced support for the 2 policies that were tested in the study. In other words, what the British Columbia did, as I explained about the history of BC climate policy and as studied in my survey and other studies, BC implemented flexible regulations, and I'm just redefining them here again because from what I understand, Sweden doesn't really have those. These are market-oriented regulations on manufacturers, retailers that requires first initially small but then growing market share of a particular technology or fuel or building design. And these regulations allow for credit trading as a compliance option to reduce costs. These policies, as shown in my studies, are largely unknown and therefore politically acceptable. So they don't have any taxation type of issues. They drive innovation because they don't prescribe any particular technology, and therefore they cause a technological change, and they don't have a high initial cost to firms and households because they start with a small percentage requirement, and that requirement increases in stringency over time. So since 2017, and that's when I worked at government, we implemented a bunch of flexible regulations and increased carbon pricing and stringency over time to leverage our domestic efforts into global efforts. We implemented a zero-emission vehicle mandate with a target to have 100% of EV sales in 2040. I know it's very far into the future compared to places like Sweden and Norway, but I'm sure policymakers are aware of this, and maybe we'll be thinking about bringing this target here closer to 2030. Increasing stringency of the low carbon fuel standard, we increased the stringency from 10% of biofuels in the fuel mix to 20%. We are also introducing the 15% renewable natural gas requirement in buildings. So those buildings that are heated with natural gas will be required to have more and more of renewable natural gas in the mix, similar to the low carbon fuel standard. In transportation fuels, this is for buildings. And certain municipalities here in BC, especially Vancouver, have some pretty outstanding policies. They they actually have this new regulation in buildings that requires a slow phase out of natural gas from all the buildings. It's basically a regulation that has this percentage requirements on consumers rather than suppliers, and with, again, penalties and fines for non-compliance. And in BC, at the provincial level, we also have methane regulations and increase in carbon tax. In Canada, at the federal level, and this is our Premier Justin Trudeau, just in case you don't know, Canada has been doing the same recently. They implemented first a carbon tax at a very low level, lower than in BC, at $20 per ton of emissions. But recently, during the COVID pandemic, increased the carbon tax to $170 by 2030. And surprisingly, the media coverage hasn't been that bad. Actually, one of my students is going to do the media coverage, media content study to compare pre and post-COVID framing of the carbon tax and other key policies at the federal level in the media analysis software. We also implemented one of the first climate policies federally was a coal phase-out policy. We joined the Power and Past the Coal International Coalition. We implemented methane regulations in oil and gas, as well as the most recent policy is a pretty stringent clean fuel standard, similar to low carbon fuel standard. It aims to cover all sectors of the economy, so it's transportation, buildings. But for now, it's focused mostly on transportation, similar to the low carbon fuel standard. This is just a recent report by the Canadian Institute for Climate Choices that came out in light of the federal government announcement to have net zero emissions by 2050. And the report shows that by 2030, at least, most of the policies that Canada has are pretty good in terms of achieving their desired emission reductions. So we have all the commercially available technologies to get there, including electric vehicles, energy efficient equipment, heat pumps. More work needs to be done on this wild card side. More work needs to be done with land use and hydrogen. These are contentious issues, especially with land use, because we have First Nations reconciliation issues. We also deal with issues of deforestation. So this is just an overview of a recent report that shows that we are on the right track. So Katya, here are my some.
Katya, I just remind you that it's 6 o'clock. So just so we have enough time to have some Q&A. Is it possible?
Yeah. Can I do 3 more minutes?
3 more minutes sounds great.
Okay, so the key messages from British Columbia. Climate sincere politicians are key to success, obviously. So we had climate concerned people implementing carbon pricing and regulations, especially in electricity and transportation. And what I found in my work is that we don't need to educate people about every single climate policy, and we need to focus on policies that are generally very supported by the general public. Other components for climate success include focusing on the post-pandemic recovery as an opportunity for a zero-emission transition, phasing out coal and gas, and introducing obviously carbon tariffs so that we can see consequences internationally, not just nationally, and we can take personal actions. And in my modeling world, our modeling information says this should be electric cars and heat pumps, something that's very obvious to people in Scandinavia, but believe me or not, it's not obvious to Canadians. It's really hard to convince Canadians to do these things. So for that reason, one of my biggest projects right now is studying consumer motivations to adopt heat pumps. There is not much literature focusing specifically on heat pumps, and definitely no literature in Canada. So we are assessing the consumer willingness. We're assessing the different factors that influence adoption. We're studying heterogeneity in home heating preferences, comparing heat pumps to other heating technology. And then we're using all this behavioral information to input that into our models to evaluate the effectiveness of policies for promoting heat pump uptake while taking into account accounting for behavioral issues that people have associated with heat pumps. And this is our behavioral framework. I'm not going to go into details, but basically it addresses attitudinal factors, contextual factors in terms of technological characteristics, home characteristics, policy awareness and knowledge characteristics, as well as social interactions and sociodemographics. And this is a discrete choice experiment that we are doing in order to address the project, to address the goals of consumer heterogeneity. This is a study that Malcolm already mentioned. We are studying the coexistence of climate sustainability and economic growth in the near future. We are starting to do this work. And other work that I do that may be interesting to you, I'm interested in this whole idea of using COVID-19 as a policy window. As I said, doing a paper on measuring the green policy response in G20 countries. I'm working on a paper with a student in Stanford on climate policy mixes to measure policy coherence in BC and California, both vertically and horizontally. And I also have a paper that's currently in the revise and resubmit status in energy policy on flexible regulations in all OECD countries. We're doing comparative analysis. I've recently completed this report that overviews all energy economy models here in Canada against consistent 7 characteristics and offer best practices for modeling climate policy. And I recently participated in a completely different project on regional climate action. We don't have regional governance mechanisms here in BC, but we are trying to scale up local climate action, and I did a survey of government priorities. So with that, I would like to thank you for your attention. I'm sorry I went over time, and I know you've seen this quote many times, but I do think it's powerful, because if we have the privilege to know, we have the duty to act. And we all have the privilege to know. This group of people on the call today, we need to act. Whatever information you learn from this, and whether it's useful or not, assess it, share it, discuss it, and we'll discuss now, obviously. And I know you have questions for me, but I also have questions for you. It's like, does any of this resonate with your experiences and realities in Sweden? Do you have lessons from Sweden for me that I could test or use in British Columbia and Canada? And do you think any of this research is interesting? If you want to collaborate, if you want to learn more, feel free to tell me. So anyways, I'll just put it out there. And thank you for your attention. Thank you, Malcolm.
Thanks very much, Katya. You have brought and put a lot on the table, and that's exactly what I hope for. So I'm going to call on a few people who've already sort of put their virtual hands up. But first, I'm going to ask my own question. So the, in the broad brushstrokes, what I take away from your presentation, and I've heard you, in various ways taken this from you before. Not surprisingly, I agree with this. You give a pretty encouraging view in economic terms. So, the idea that this requires a dramatic transformation of everybody's lives, that it costs us standard of living to deal with climate change, you reject that. You tell a pretty encouraging story, we can do this. On the other hand, the story you tell politically, with some exceptions from, a relatively, more optimistic take on British Columbia and so on, politically, the story you tell is much less encouraging. There's a lot of barriers in the way you present the whole panorama here. And I certainly agree with your take on most of this. But there's one part that I think is provocative in what you're saying, and I just want to push you on that a little bit, which is what you call the agenda hitching. And you've basically implied that ignorance, well, you put it in your presentation, ignorance is bliss, right? That in a sense, it's better if the public don't exactly know what's going on, because, good climate policy can basically be enacted without the public even knowing about it. It's not going to hurt them. What they don't know isn't going to hurt them. So why should we care? And you sort of have a kind of minimalist preference, avoiding hitching, in a sense, climate action to other things. But of course, in certain jurisdictions in the world, it's very common to hear people advocate something extremely different. So, the whole conversation about a Green New Deal in America is the exact opposite of what you've just said. we need to transform communities in ways that they will see and experience as directly beneficial to themselves. I mean, basically, the Green New Deal is a giant agenda hitching kind of program. And I don't disagree with your policy analysis, but I wonder if it is, in fact, very hard to resist calls to hitch climate to other things. Do you think there's any basis to hope that we can actually make that work? In the sense that, are there cases you've seen anywhere where hitching to other sorts of agendas of any kind did in fact succeed? Maybe it didn't help, but did it at least not hurt, in a sense, the case for climate action? Because I just sometimes think it's actually going to be very hard not to go along with that to some degree, if you understand what I mean.
Yeah. Thank you for this question. I actually get it quite often. And I think I need to clarify that I'm trying to influence this global change idea of how we transition very fast to a zero emission future, because we don't have any time to engage in very long dialogues and discussions about the right way or the right perception of what needs to be done. I think you're touching on a multitude of topics. One of them is behavioral versus technological change. So many of those agenda hitching biases have to do with the fact that people believe in a voluntary behavioral change, and there is nothing wrong with that. I think that technological change should be and must be accompanied by behavioral change. In fact, when we have the right policies in place and technological changes happening, behavioral changes happen at the same time, and it's way easier to do those things that many people advocate for, like we should only bike to work or we should stop eating red meat. I think there will be more and more people like that once we actually have a profound technological change happening through a compulsory climate policy. I also understand that it's very difficult to be a good politician. Like, what is a good politician? I've worked in government. I've seen people come to government and cry about anything that they believe in. They strongly have invested their careers or free time in understanding a particular issue. They strongly believe that a particular way of developing and then reducing emissions is the right way. You can't ignore those people. You have to hear all the different voices. And that's why, good democracies, they require engagement. They require talking to everyone who has an opinion. So I'm not advocating for that. I think engagement and communication is absolutely a part of healthy democracy. And we need the change at the community level, something that's not happening enough at the community, at the local municipality level here in British Columbia, because our municipalities and in Canada in general, our municipalities are designed in a very different way than in other parts of the world. They don't have much authority or capacity to act on climate change, whereas, all the change on climate should happen at the community level. So there are lots of questions and topics you touched on here. I just want to say that everything is good in moderation, as long as politicians don't spend all their time addressing those agenda hitching biases and redirect the entire, climate strategy to focus on those particular nuanced views that all the scientific evidence, economic modeling shows is not the most effective way to reduce emissions. We just need to think perspective. If people are saying that biking is the only way to address emissions, we should also look at some evidence that shows that people actually love their cars, and it will be very difficult to convince everyone to bike to work. So I hope I addressed your question to an extent.
Yeah, absolutely. Let me get. We've got some people asking questions in the chat, so I'm going to get some other people to express their points of view. So, Joe, I have you next.
Oh, thanks. Thanks, Katya. So I wanted to ask you a bit about the notion of political cost and So I guess you'd framed it as a kind of individual-based thing. You were thinking about the policies that people knew about, that they felt strongly about. So I wanted to ask you a bit about kind of lobbying, I guess, and how you think that might affect the dynamics of this sort of preference and the cost as things evolve. I mean, I know that the way you framed this wasn't as though this was meant to be like a predictive tool necessarily, so this is more a kind of speculative thought than a challenge. But I guess my perception is that lobbying does quite a lot of work with this kind of policy making in the form of regulatory submissions, direct donations, ad campaigns, convincing people that a policy will harm them and so on. So I just wondered if you've kind of done work on that, what you thought about the impact that it has on kind of selecting these policies in a strategic way.
Okay, thank you, Joe. And I haven't done work on lobbying particularly, but I'll just say that the political acceptance concept that I have studied in the past and I'm studying right now looks only at one component of political acceptability, which is citizen support, as is taken as a blank, static measure. There are obviously many factors that influence this citizen support that include media, lobbying, talking to friends, having particular values, trust in particular agencies. So there are a lot of factors that go into that do influence citizen perceptions. On the stakeholder perception side, I completely agree with you that that's the piece that deserves a research attention. And I've seen it myself in government when, one particular stakeholder that can represent 5% of all the other stakeholders has a very vested interest, has a lot of power and funding to lobby and advocate for a particular policy choice. And they would have the biggest say in political decisions. I've seen it myself. And funny enough, of course, we know that for the fossil fuel industry has all the money to do that. I've seen all sorts of lobbying happen. And I think the fossil fuel industry is just so smart in how they approach lobbying. The very last thing that I saw in government before I moved to academia was actually like this new thing when an oil and gas representative would come in and actually lobby for a very high carbon tax because they say this is good for us, this is good for the economy. And they know the government will never implement such a carbon tax, but they are supportive in theory. So I think it's what they're doing is quite clever. They have a lot of money spent on marketing research to understand how to do this kind of lobbying. Absolutely, you're right. Lobbying, it can be very powerful.
Great, thanks.
Gustav wanted to get in on a direct follow-up to that last point.
Oh, yeah, I thought it connected. I was very interested. You mentioned very briefly this, that you had a measure of political difficulty, how politically difficult it was to do something. And you did that on a slide when you compared how much it cost. And I wonder if you could tell us more about this. This was rather intriguing, so I was very interested.
That was a very simple calculation, just wasn't even in the scope of the research, but that's something that seemed interesting to explore. And I'm writing a grant on that. I want to do more research into comparing the political difficulty because for that specific measure, so what I took is the level of strong opposition to the different types of policies. And I divided that by the amount of tons, emission tons reduced from each particular policy, and then said one policy is more politically difficult than another policy per ton of emissions reduced. That was a very quick exercise that requires more research attention because you need to have those tons from each policy estimated using one consistent method. In my method, I didn't use one consistent method. I took information from literature on modeling literature and some other literature on emission reductions from those policies. A good researcher would run all these policies and you can take existing policies or hypothetical policies to achieve targets, to understand their emission reduction potential, then have a consistent method, like a survey method, to measure strong opposition to those policies, and take the strong opposition levels and compare them to the emission reductions for the different policy types. So I want to do that in my future research. That's something that I'm interested in, because there is no, there are not too many quantitative measures for political costs of climate action. I think that would be quite a novel contribution.
Yeah, so I wonder, is this measure connecting to, there's this old BANSAF measure of political power, and that has been used for seeing what's the probability of getting something through a legislature, then developed by Dahl and others. Is something like that, or?
No, I haven't done that kind of probability analysis. I know the studies you're talking about. I've seen them. I'm not a political, I'm not a hardcore political scientist. I'm everything, and that, which makes it, sometimes super hard, but also super interesting to investigate all sorts of topics. That was a very crude measure of just, saying that, look, carbon tax is very difficult here in Canada and British Columbia, but at the same time, the federal government just implemented the $170 carbon tax that didn't receive that much negative attention, because right now we are scared of COVID and we're not paying attention to climate policy, really. So we'll see what happens with this new government, whether they get reelected. I think the reelection is coming. And there will be, of course, a variety of factors, not just the carbon tax. There will be the COVID recovery. But I would be very interested, Gustav, in working with someone like you, whoever else is an expert in the field of political science, to better understand the different political cost measures for climate policy.
No, they are very tricky. I was just curious, because it is tricky and not so well developed. People have tried to develop these measures of political power, and which connects them to political difficulty. But there are some things that have moved forward there. But indeed.
Gustav, did you want to ask a separate question as well? Because you're next in the queue if you had a distinct question.
Why don't you push me back in the queue and take Kian, and I can jump in after at the end of the queue, and I can ask another question.
Okay.
So put me in.
Kian, are you there?
I am, yes. Thanks so much for that great presentation. Lots of interesting food for thought. So a small question and then a larger question. The small question was, you had those predictors, various things that predicted support for policies. One of them was being female. I was curious, was that support for green policies across the board, or was there some subsection? Was it like the pricing as opposed to regulatory hard cap policies, or was it quite general? That was the small question. And then the larger question is, when we're thinking about the practical implementation of these various things, I've become really concerned about timescales. So of course, as climate change advances, we have less and less time to try to make any of the targets that we want to make. And of course, with RPS, CES, we have these ramp up periods. Also with carbon taxes, we have ramp up periods. We have that in British Columbia. We have that in other jurisdictions as well, as you know. So I don't know if that means that they all sort of suffer in terms of their capacity to deal in the relevant timescales, or maybe some of them would work a little bit faster or slower. As someone who's thought more about the relative merit of the different policies, I was wondering if you could weigh in on that. So of course, we know that carbon taxes are more efficient, economically speaking, and it gets benefits that way. But I was wondering on this other metric if there might be relative gains. Thanks.
Thank you, Kian. Great question. So the very first minor question about females and all other variables, I listed all the variables that consistently were predictors of support for all the 5 policies that I tested in the survey. It's not an aggregate measure. My dependent variables were 5 different policy types, but it worked out that being a female, having altruistic values, having trust in renewable industry, and beliefs in policy effectiveness were the 4 main predictors for all policy types. consistently. And there were other unique predictors discussed in the paper and other papers after this paper. So yeah, being a female apparently is a positive thing for climate change. But I think that's quite common for any environmental behavior. In terms of time scales, you're completely right that we're dealing with the ramping up idea for most policies, carbon pricing and regulations. And of course, from the economic perspective and also from the political acceptance perspective, this is really helpful because it gives certainty to economic agents in terms of planning into the future and not incurring a giant initial cost of decarbonization. So to answer your question, that's why governments have a mix of policies, because they have so many different ramp-up periods. Politicians understand that one policy will not do it all. So we need to have a bunch of policies with various stringencies. Some are more, some are less effective. And when working in government, I was actually dealing with the modeling of emissions into the future and different scenarios, and the determination of the final scenario that went into the Clean BC climate plan. And we tested a bunch of time scales and ramp up strategies and came up with the one that was the closest to achieving our targets and also was politically acceptable by stakeholders, but also by our ministerial partners who were responsible for those policies, because there are a lot of questions and not only questions, but also lobby stuff that happens for each policy. And therefore, you need to account for all these political realities. So we need a mix of policies. And that's why I'm interested in the idea of policy coherence, to understand whether we have these mixes that we have at national and subnational levels, whether they are effective, whether we're having some redundant policies in place and just running these giant departments and governments that are basically not very important, or maybe for political reasons, we do need to have those redundant policies. What are vertical coherence mechanisms? So national, subnational policies, are they complementary or they're redundant? And same at the horizontal level, at the different policy types, how do they interact in addressing emission reductions as well as public support?
Thanks. I'd love to follow up offline at some point, but that's great. Thanks.
Of course.
Thanks, Kian. Okay, next I have Krister in the queue.
Hello, hi. Thank you so much for a very interesting talk. I just have two questions, I think. The first one, I think, relates to Malcolm's question, because there's one way of sort of interpreting what you're saying as it's putting forward a dilemma. So given the time constraints and given the goals, to achieve those goals, we might have to sacrifice certain crucial democratic values. For instance, transparency when it comes to public decisions. Of course, that transparency will have some negative side effects when it comes to implementation of policies. So I thought you that was one reading of the ignorance is bliss and the other things you said. But then you wanted to respond to Malcolm saying, well, it's also important to communicate and so on. But I think isn't there a dilemma there, especially given the time constraints? As you said, at one point, we might not have time to have a dialogue about these things, right? And that's a serious issue. So I think there seems to be a real dilemma to be had there. And perhaps you have actually experience of politicians seeing that dilemma and being quite sort of concerned about how they should behave, in fact, if they want to be Democrats or believe in democracy. So that's my first question. The second question is actually about the underlying modeling, because as I understood you, your results are heavily based on modeling. So my question is just, is those models sort of things that people agree on, or are there actually quite a lot of scientific disagreements about those models? Because, especially now in the COVID times, about modeling, but COVID-19 related issues, there have been tons of disagreements about the modelings, how reliable they are and so on. So that's the question. Second question about the scientific agreement or disagreements about the models you're using?
Yeah, great questions. Thank you, Christopher. So the first question on communication, the amount of communication that's needed. Do we need to spend all our time communicating to everyone? And I think because we have these democratic systems in place, communication happens implicitly all the time. Like we have websites, we have news releases. It's a question of how much communication we need to do. Do we need to engage every single stakeholder, and also accounting for how government works? And yeah, a lot of factors that influence government policy decisions. So when I worked in the BC government and we were implementing Clean BC, it was quite interesting because I actually started under the Liberal government, and they were the ones who froze the carbon tax and were not really acting on climate change anymore because the federal government wasn't acting, no one was acting. And then in 2016-17, we had an election and we had a minority government. NDP, the left-center government, got minority government. So they spent about a year trying to merge efforts with our third minor party, Green Party, to have this majority joint government. So for about a year, we're not doing anything in government. We will just sitting and waiting for some mandate letters to happen to understand where we are going with climate policy. And then once they had the joint agreement signed, everything started to happen fast. And honestly, there was almost no communication with anyone about the climate policy. We probably designed the plan within a couple of months. It wasn't insane, the intensity of work and modeling and plan writing, and ironically, all the communication happened after the plan. I think they chose a very smart strategy. They got the plan endorsed by the most leading experts in the field from a variety of sectors in the economy to kind of have this safety net, and then started pretty effective communication. Unfortunately, we didn't engage with First Nations. Here, it's the big issue here, land issues and reconciliation in BC and in Canada overall. So that's kind of a piece that was definitely missing from a strategic point of view. And so the post-plan communication was happening and is happening right now. But in a way, it was a smart strategy to implement very effective policy and then to do communication later, so that we have that policy. Also, I think many politicians understand that one of the best ways to implement an effective policy is to call it a pilot project. I think it's similar to Stockholm, what was done with bike lanes, and it's a similar idea here, especially at the local government level. Politicians introduce this pilot projects such as bike lanes and other infrastructure, and then they, of course, once it's in place, it's very easy to keep it in place. People get used to it. So how does the communication happen? Communication happen through experience. So you experience it and then okay, I guess I'm used to it, and there is not much public opposition left, and the pilot project becomes a permanent project. So I don't know if I answered that question, but I believe that we don't need to educate every single person about the importance of climate action or the importance of a particular climate policy tool. People are simply not interested, and they have a lot of their own stuff to deal with, and they filter information through their set of values and worldviews, as we know. So just have to be strategic in terms of how we design our communication. And in terms of models, the second question about the scientific agreement or disagreement, of course, there is a lot of disagreement, like in any field. And again, this has to do with perfectionist views. In modeling, people seem to care about their models like about their babies, instead of trying to, keep developing them and improving them. People get on the protective side, and then this has to do with the self-interest once again. So what I did in my very recent study, because of that kind of lack of consistency in the literature in terms of like what model is best for modeling climate plans, for example, I decided to do an overview of all energy economy models, and not integrated assessment models that look also at natural systems, and not energy systems models that look only at the engineering part of like electrification and dealing with more technical characteristics. I deal with energy economy models that look at the interactions between different energy types and the economy, for projecting emissions and economic outcomes. And I did a review of 24 models that we have here in Canada, and I used also elsewhere in the world, and assessed them against 7 consistent characteristics to say, like, what models are really good at representing macroeconomy, what models are really good at representing human behavior, at incorporating uncertainty, at looking at technology, specific technology characteristics, and kind of design this matrix tables, an inventory of models for policymakers and researchers to use. And I have to say, like, while this was well received by the funding agency, it's not easy to publish such research, because it goes to those to the reviewers who are modelers, who use a particular model, and they get upset about how the model is compared to other models. And yeah, so there is a disagreement. But again, is this the right time to disagree? I think there is a consistent, there is some consensus on the key decarbonization actions. It's the disagreement in methodologies that are used in models, disagreement in very small details that lead us to delaying in climate action. We should try to avoid that at all costs. And we have to say that the BC government has been quite good at that. They started with a company that was actually created by my previous PhD supervisor. They started with that model for its advantages, competitive advantages compared to others. And then they validated the model, then a new model was introduced, and they again validated the model. It's not perfect, doesn't address all the possible questions. It doesn't have land use components, but it's a consistent tool that is now trusted, similar to how like politicians get trusted. There is a tool that is trusted by this government consistently through many different governments, and as a result, other governments are starting to trust the tool. I just hope that the tool doesn't have significant flaws. But I think overall, the idea is clear. We need to decarbonize electricity, transportation, and then buildings and industry. And so that's what the government is doing.
Thank you. Just a sort of a comment on the modeling part. So we actually have a sort of project at the Institute, and Joe Russos is sort of leading that, about how to communicate modeling results to policymakers. And so we just a question, actually follow up. Do you actually communicate the uncertainty of the models you are recommending as tools?
Yeah, so that was one piece of research that it's not widely covered in literature, and that we covered in this report. So most models have at least one method of incorporating uncertainty and producing uncertainty-related results. However, it's not very clear how those are communicated. One advantage of the model that the BC government uses is that it's pretty clear about the main parameters in the model that have the highest uncertainty. And it's very easy to interpret those uncertainty results. And I think that's what politicians actually like. They like having a range of estimates. It's hard because, you have one number and you're committed to that number in the climate plan. And then you have to stand by it. And then the media just tears you apart if you're not achieving the target. So I think politicians more and more recognize the need to have uncertainty analysis and the need to learn how to communicate that uncertainty. When I worked in government at the BC level, we worked with other governments nationally organized, that initiative was organized by the federal government. Actually, we had a project on how to communicate uncertainty in modeling. I don't think we achieved any consensus on how to do that, but I think governments are getting better over time with how to communicate the results. It's absolutely a skill. We need a knowledge translator. And often it comes down to just one person in the entire subnational government who understands how to do that, which is pretty scary, because if that person goes, then all this trust is lost. So maybe it's a field of where we need to train students to become leaders at translating scientific information, not just energy economy modeling, but also climate modeling and other economic analysis results.
So we just have a few minutes left, and I was going to sort of close it, but then Tim just came in with a question. And so go ahead, Tim.
What about
Sorry. It's kind of a softball question. So it's about carbon leakage. So you mentioned that one reason to focus on regulating electricity and transportation is that just in many countries, about half of their emissions come from those industries, and that's production-based emissions, I assume. So do you also think that a reason for focusing on those industries is that they're less trade exposed? Because you seem to mention that at one point, and for that reason, leakage would be less of a concern for regulations in those industries?
Yeah, absolutely. And not only leakage, it's the reason why we need to focus on those sectors first. Modeling and just economic analysis information shows that we have technologies that are commercially available and getting cheaper and cheaper over time to reduce emissions in those sectors. So comparatively speaking, yes, leakage is smaller in transportation and electricity compared to trade exposed sectors such as cement, aluminum, steel sectors that are price takers and compete internationally quite heavily. So that's why I emphasize action in electricity and transportation, followed by buildings and followed by light duty industry. And of course, we need to have carbon tariffs to avoid all the issues of leakage. That's one component of research that needs to be strengthened. I don't do any research in the field, but I would certainly be interested in the coming years exploring the issue of carbon tariffs and political realities associated with how to implement them and where they will work and where they will not work, and the kind of arguments people will come up with.
Thanks.
So I would say the issue of carbon tariffs is going to be very interesting because in about 2 months, I guess it is, the European Commission is going to release basically a proposal for some sort of European carbon tariff. And just a couple of days, I noticed some of the large developing countries were already issuing very sort of assertive statements that they don't like this idea one bit. So we will see some very interesting international politics around that. But Gustav wants to get in with one final question, and I suspect he will have the last one. Go ahead, Gustav.
You've been touching up on this. I want you to tell me more about that, because it seemed to me to be a little bit of a hard line to draw between what is agenda hitching and what is actually real stuff. And so I want you to tell me more about this. So take this flying planes, and it's true that that's 2.5% of the total CO2 emission. A little bit higher if you compensate for the fact that you let it out on high altitude. So then I think it counts for 4% of efficiency. Still, that's quite a lot. Of course, it's less than concrete, which is 5-8%, or steel, that is 5-8%, but it's not that far away. So I wonder what you meant when you said flying planes there. And I wonder, is it that what you're talking about, or is it rather this some people have criticized and think that that's a way of kind of doing agenda hitching or trying to do deflection or delay, and that is by individualizing. that we're talking about that, individuals have to stop flying. We're not talking about systemic change, where we have to change our transport system. Rather than that we should just forget about all this flying. That's okay, we can go on flying. So perhaps you could expand on that. And then the second question is a bit unfair question, but it connects also to your question in the end. Of course, you're focusing on BC, and you asked, is there some similar problems between Canada or Sweden, given your talk? I mean, one problem I think about Sweden's policy is that it's very much focused on Sweden. So we should go carbon neutral. And even if that can actually mean that we increase the carbon emission worldwide by, for example, we only look at domestic emissions. And in our official goals, we don't look at the emission coming from what we import. So I wonder if you could, your focus here, you didn't mention anything, I think, about the importance of BC or Canada to work for solving this globally rather than focus on the local level. But maybe that's an unfair question, given that was the perhaps purpose of your talk. But I think that is a problem of Sweden's policy, for example.
No, I think these are all great questions. So in terms of any of this information that I list here, this is a collection of empirical evidence, also communication frames from the social media, a general collection of communication when it comes to, like, say, implementing a stringent climate policy like a carbon tax, and the type of arguments that you see in the media. They have to do with, like, there are better ways to address climate change than a carbon tax. We just should stop, economic growth. Let's not fly as much. Let's be socially responsible in terms of what we consume, in terms of food. Let's stop eating meat. Let's drive less. Let's just save energy instead of spending it all the time, using it all the time. So these are not meant to say that these are wrong arguments. They all have their contribution to emission reductions, absolutely. What I'm saying here, once again, is that this type of changes at the behavioral level, they are not sufficient for us to achieve deep decarbonization at a community level, at a subnational level, at a national level, and not enough to achieve emission reductions globally. We all we need a systematic change in how we operate our economies, and that change, the fastest way to achieve that change is through technological change. And that's why I advocate for policies that actually force, for the most part, for suppliers to supply low carbon technologies to consumers, and like zero emission vehicle mandate. Like, we are stuck with buying electric vehicles because there are more and more of them as a result of the policy in the market. And therefore people are switching to electric vehicles, but they're not switching to biking. They're not choosing to fly less, because for them it's a completely different type of behavioral change that may happen in the future, but it's really difficult to achieve within the necessary time frame. So take all these arguments with a little bit of a grain of salt. It's because these are meant to say that these arguments should not dominate the discussion behind the most effective policy that needs to be implemented to help us achieve deep decarbonization. And in terms of what BC and Canada does to enable a global transition to deep decarbonization, I touched a little bit on that in the talk, but obviously joining coalitions and campaigns to phase out coal and natural gas and other fossil fuels is one part of that. Working with those ally countries or jurisdictions who join the campaigns more towards the implementation of carbon tariffs is obviously the right answer to leverage all these domestic efforts into a global effort. And I think having a market-based regulations and carbon pricing is the best way to encourage that innovation. And with that innovation, we are reducing global costs of the technology such as electric vehicles and heat pumps. And so hopefully the developing countries don't have to deal with very high costs of those technologies. They will have an advantage of adopting those lower carbon emission technologies due to our climate policies in the developed world.
Thanks.
Speaking of time frames, I think our time is up. So thank you very much to Katya for sharing this work with us today. Very interesting.
Thank you for having me.
Some very nice tie-ins to work that people at the Institute are doing, including somewhat, intriguingly issues of modeling and communication and uncertainty. Didn't really see that, but actually that's an area of expertise at the Institute, and very interesting to hear that discussion. Thanks to everyone for coming, and great questions. And I hope that Katya gets to meet people at the Institute in person in the future, like I said at the start. Last thing I need to say is I just will give you the information on upcoming talks at the Institute. On April 28th, we have Julia Steinberger, who I think is going to build on similar themes as today, but with a very different perspective. A talk entitled, "Is it possible to live well within planetary limits?" ? And then May 5th, we have Marcus Yenti, if I've got his last name correctly pronounced. And so please plan to come to those.